So, as you all noticed, I've been talking about Astra Militarum war gear in the last few episodes, but what is the Imperial Guard actually? In this episode, I'll try and make it as clear as possible. As always, leave a like or subscribe if you're feeling extremely generous. Astra Militarum, more commonly known as the Imperial Guard, is one of the greatest military forces in the 41st millennium. They serve as a primary fighting force and first line of defense against all that endangers the Imperium of man. The Imperial Guard is usually the first response if a local PDF can't contain an invasion or insurrection. The Imperial Guard consists of countless billions of men and women, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different regiments, and is supported by a vast array of light and heavily armored vehicles and artillery. They also garrison major locations of strategic or cultural interest to the Imperium and are often found in defensive roles. The Imperial Guard fight a never-ending war for the survival of mankind in an unrelenting hostile universe. Whilst the Imperial Guard can bring an amazing amount of force to bear against their enemies, they are not as direct or precise a weapon as the Space Marines. Although there is no universal uniform or even command hierarchy in the Astra Militarum, it is compulsory for every regiment to have at least one commissar attached to maintain the discipline and morale of the troops whilst being on the lookout for any signs of corruption or heresy. I'll go into the details about commissars on a later date, since it would derail this episode. It is worth noting though that a vast number of worlds copy the uniform and equipment used by the regiments of the Cadian shock troops, who are viewed as being the most effective of the Astra Militarum's infantry units, due to their display of enviable levels of discipline, excellent marksmanship, and a cynical gallows humor. The primary combat tactic of the Astra Militarum is to overwhelm the enemy with their endless numbers, whilst at the same time hammer them in submission with devastating artillery and crush them with powerful main battle tanks. The Imperial Guard has its origins in the late 30th millennium, when the Emperor formed the Imperium of Man. Although the Space Marines were at the forefront of most battles, they could not, and would for the most part, not be used as garrison troops due to the relative scarcity of Marines. Although every Astartes is the equal of dozens of men and holds formidable battle prowess, they are not in limitless supply, and the demands of conquering a galactic empire meant that their troops were ever stretched thinner and thinner. So to ensure the momentum of the Great Crusade did not falter, the Imperial Army was created, also known in High Gothic as the Imperialis Auxilia. The Imperial Army was a vital part of the Great Crusade. Gargantuan numbers of troops, ranks of battle tanks, and armadas of capital-class starships were raised and subordinated to the Astartes. At first, the Imperial Army was employed for garrison duties and to mop up resistance in the wake of the Legion's initial assaults, utilized where the back of an enemy was already broken and compliance only required a watchful eye. Eventually, certainly by the time the Great Crusade reached the eastern fringe of the galaxy, the troops and starships of the Imperial Army were deployed at its forefront, fighting alongside the power-armored super soldiers of the Legionis Astartes. But everything changed when the galaxy was ripped asunder by the treachery of the War Master Horus, triggering a cataclysmic interstellar civil war that engulfed the newly founded Imperium. In the aftermath of this so-called Horus heresy, the organizational structure of the forces of the Imperium were revised significantly, to prevent the possibility of large-scale rebellion occurring again within the Imperial armed forces. The titanic armies of the Imperium were divided. The remaining loyalist Space Marine legions were split up into 1,000-man chapters, whilst the Imperial Army ceased to exist. No longer would ground commanders give orders to interstellar spaceships, or vice versa. From the ashes of the Imperial Army, the Imperial Guard was born, together with the Imperial Navy. The Imperial Guard was reorganized and divided into smaller regiments, and commissars were introduced to ensure loyalty and discipline. Since the Imperial Guard and Navy were now separate entities, it meant that ground commanders that turned traders were stuck on the planet they were currently stationed, and if a Navy fleet turned, it would not have access to ground troops or resupply. Whilst this made every part of the army a bit weaker, it also meant that it was safer to deploy troops and warships. Every planetary lord or imperial governor is responsible for the defense of their world. Since the planet may need to defend itself against enemies for many months or even years before it can be reinforced, most of these leaders take their job very seriously. There are wildly different standards for the training of PDF troops. On one planet, it can take the form of an official military. In another, it can come in the form of hive gangs or even tribals armed with obsolete weaponry. Each of these troops is an individual regimentum. They are free to defend their own world and enforce their own laws as long as they don't conflict with the wider Imperium and they pay their tithes. A part of the annual tithes is to send 1/10 of their overall fighting force, or more if the Monitorum deems it necessary, to fight the Emperor's wars elsewhere in the galaxy. The exact number of regiments to be raised depends on the tithe grade and its proximity to hostile war zones. For a hive world, such as for instance Armageddon, a draft can be around 100 million men and several million vehicles, whilst for a far-flung agri-world, it can be as low as 5 million men and mostly cavalry. Whatever the numbers, if the troops sent are of subpar quality, the governor will be executed. For this reason, the troops selected tend to be the elite of the planet's troops. The method of recruiting also vary wildly from world to world. On Katasha, every man, woman and child is expected to serve. Whilst on a seeding hive world, it isn't uncommon for entire generations to be drafted and sent to fight. These troops are often only given the choice to serve or to be executed. On many planets though, service is seen as noble and brings honor to the rulers. Many hopeful souls will join the world's military forces in the hope of being selected for the guard, so they can escape a life of endless work shifts. Upon their founding, regiments are identified by their planet of origin and a number. As example, the Cadian 144th is the 144th regiment to be raised on the fortress world of Cadia, but the number in itself isn't uncommon to be reused, following the destruction of the regiment. In this way, a regiment will be refounded with recruits tasked with upholding its honor and traditions. The uniforms of different regiments will change dramatically from world to world. It can be a full battle dress, or even tribal war gear. The only thing all guardsmen have in common is that they carry some form of lasgun, since that is a cheap, reliable and easy to produce weapon. Although there are many forms of regiments, they will for the most part be uniform in its tactical composition. Infantry regiments will contain little to no heavy artillery, whilst a tank regiment will have nearly no infantry attached. Whilst this makes for a weakness of sorts, it makes it so that should a regiment fall to the dark forces, or falls under the sway of Xenos influence, it can be safely destroyed by another regiment or combination of regiments that counters it. Regiments are typically raised with a strength of several thousand soldiers, but the precise numbers can vary enormously. The Valhallan 18th Tundra Wolves consists of over 120,000 men, whilst the Vostroyan 24th Ironblood's armored company comprises less than 1,500 tank crewmen. Regiments of Baneblades and Shadow Swords, each an armored behemoth capable of laying waste to a small army by itself, rarely consists of more than a dozen super heavy tanks. The basic principle held by the Departamentum Munitorum is that regardless of the number of men-at-arms or the exact composition of armored vehicles, the overall fighting strength, and hence combat effectiveness of one regiment is equivalent to any other. This is clearly a gross oversimplification, but a necessary one when organizing wars on a galactic scale. Some planets are able to raise a variety of regiments. Cadia, or Armageddon for example, are huge worlds embroiled in seemingly endless wars, whose populace are given ample opportunities to train in various aspects of warfare. By comparison, other worlds take great and often pride in their reputation for training a specific kind of regiment to exceptional standards. The pale-skinned stealth infantry of the night world Prometheron, or the clockwork discipline of the Calatian artillery brigades, are excellent examples of this. Feral or feudal worlds, on the other hand, often provide only infantry or rough rider regiments, thus circumventing a huge potential culture shock. Leadership at company and regimental level is a duty assigned to officers recruited from the same world, and normally from the same founding, as the regiment they lead. This practice ensures that local planetary nobles are placed in charge of those culturally disposed to offer them deference. Officers stay with the troopers they have spent solar months or Terran years training, and disruption to regimental morale is minimized. These officers will be supported and observed by regimental commissars, attached during their founding by the Munitorum. These men and women must look to their regiment's morale and loyalty above all else, and will take any measure, no matter how extreme, to ensure the troops do not disgrace themselves, whether on or off the field of battle. In those instances where a threat to the Imperium cannot be repulsed by local defense forces and naval assets, the Departamento Munitorum will sanction immediate deployment of the Imperial Guard. Such a response will be guided by the wisdom imparted in the strategic parables of the Munitorum. This threat response pattern has served the Imperial well for over thousands of standard years. Initial forces will be drawn from localized assets deemed sufficient for the task at hand. This includes any guardsmen already mobilized within response range, along with regiments raised from neighboring worlds. Such forces can be disparate in nature, requiring officers to prove themselves adept at working with whatever material is at hand. Should the threat escalate or prove greater than initial response forces can handle, the Munitorum will expand their designated conflict zone, drawing down relentless waves of reinforcements to crash upon the foe until it is entirely ground to dust. In this way, even the onrushing fury of an orc Wa can be brought to a grinding halt, or the nimble Eldar drowned in manpower and ordnance. Regiments en route to their designated war zone usually possess some previous military experience, whether it's inherited or earned through campaigns already fought in the Emperor's name. While aboard their troop ships, these regiments will be further trained to deal with the specifics of war into which they are being sent. Whether this is learning to recognize and combat particularly inhuman foes, use of environment-specific equipment, or acclimatization to peculiarities of their destination world, such an orientation can be vital. Imperial Guard regiments from feral worlds, for example, would be rendered catatonic if unprepared for the immensity of the standard Imperial hive city. On deployment, Imperial Guard forces operate according to the tenets of the Tactica Imperium, stringently enforced by their rigid chains of command. Regiments complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, ensuring that the army as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When facing especially ferocious or peculiar enemies, such as demons spilling from a warbrand or the horror of a Tyranid swarm, this standardized method of making war can encounter costly snags. Yet, with a constant flow of new manpower enjoyed by high command, individual engagements with casualty rates as high as 100% can be considered rousingly successful, providing the fallen first achieve their allotted tasks or highlight some strategic weakness in the foe. When an army is assembled, regiments are drawn from many different planets, resulting in a conglomeration of uniforms and combat skills rather than a single homogeneous force. Bioscreen technotroopers fight side by side with primitive barbarians, and noble-born soldiers rub shoulders with the lowliest hive gang fighters. When Grax invaded the Risa system, all planets within 10 light years were ordered to recruit and raise at least an additional 50 regiments as a primary reaction to counter the Orc invasion. Should the Imperium's response not prove to be decisive in crushing an enemy, then the sphere around the conflict zone is increased in ever larger increments, as reinforcements are drawn from further away and more regiments are raised to replace the losses. This ponderous process repeats itself until the enemy is ground down and destroyed, the massed forces of the Astra Militarum slowly pounding at the foe until eventually the hammer blow is delivered and all resistance is completely and utterly shattered. In this way, the harder a foe strikes at the Imperium, the greater its response will be. Many of the newly raised regiments inducted into the Astra Militarum will already have some modicum of fighting experience. This may have taken the form of formal military instruction, or simply be the result of the harsh conditions in which they live. Only the strongest survive the gang wars of the hive worlds, the tribal conflicts of medieval feudal worlds, or the carnivorous predators that stalk the dead worlds. In any case, during the long voyage between their homeworld and the regiment's destination, the newly inducted guardsmen will receive intensive training that tempers the natural fighting skills of their many disparate cultures and forges them into soldiers worthy of the Astra Militarum. They are trained in the use of specialized weaponry and vehicles, and receive proper indoctrination into the imperial cult. Officers are tutored in the broader aspects of the Tactitia Imperium, all the while being judged under the vigilant gaze of the Officio Praefectus. The regiment will be drilled for many solar weeks before their trial by fire in the crucible of war. The training is also intended to adapt and, where necessary, re-educate the new recruits for the inevitable shock of fighting on foreign worlds. It is unlikely that a guardsman from the monolithic spires of the Hive City has ever seen the open sky, whilst those from a backwater agriworld will never have seen the towering might of a mountain-sized basilica sanctum or set foot inside the twisting labyrinth of a sprawling factorum city. Should a regiment survive a campaign, it is unlikely that it will return to its homeworld, moving instead from one war zone to another. As casualties reduce the overall strength of fighting forces, regiments are often amalgamated together so that, united, they can continue to wage the Emperor's wars, where possible. Two half strengths with regiments from the same militarum regimentum will combine, but it is not uncommon for two disparate cultures to find themselves brothers in arms. Many of the commanders declare that the reduced efficiency of these combined regiments makes them barely worth their rations, infighting and mistrust hampering their battlefield effectiveness. Other commanders are interested only in the number of men-at-arms that they can field. Their successful integration as fighting units is secondary concern. A handful of particularly canny officers prefer to lead combined regiments, as they can harness the diverse skill sets and ingrained competitiveness of their soldiers. If a regiment has been so badly mauled that it is considered a waste of time and resources to combine it with other imperial forces, they may be assigned garrison duties on a nearby world, usually the very same planet they have been fighting over. The safety of the world and its population becomes the duty of the regiment's remnants. The garrisoning of such worlds is vital. After a brutal war in which the local defense forces are inevitably decimated and the planetary government left in tatters, the small Astra Militarum contingent may be the only loyal force left to impose law and maintain control for many solar decades. In rare circumstances, a regiment may be granted custodianship over a world as a reward. The officers of such forces inevitably become wealthy and powerful figures In the society they maintain watch over, forming the new noble and ruling classes. So that was it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a comment or a like, and if you're feeling generous, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for ideas, so if you have any idea about what to talk about next, please leave an idea in the comments. I read every comment and I look forward to seeing you guys again. Bye everyone.